Mrs. Margaret sat by the fireplace, gently stroking her silver hair, her cloudy eyes gazing far beyond the window frame. Outside, the quiet night enveloped the old small house, broken only by the whispering wind rustling through the trees, disrupting the stillness. Jason sat beside her, his bright eyes full of curiosity, eagerly awaiting the late-night story that she always told him before bed. Today, Mrs. Margaret seemed more pensive than usual. Jason asked, his voice hesitant, "Grandma, what story will you tell me tonight?" Mrs. Margaret smiled softly, but the sadness remained etched on her weathered face. She pulled her knitted scarf up to her neck, as if the tale she was about to share would carry with it the chill of distant memories. After a moment of silence, she spoke in a solemn tone. "Have you ever heard of Willowwood Park?" Jason was taken aback and shook his head. He had never heard of this place before. Willowwood, Mrs. Margaret began, is a small park on the outskirts of town. Once, it was a place where people gathered to have fun, where the laughter of children echoed through the air. But then, one stormy night, everything changed. Jason listened intently to every word she spoke, as if he were being drawn into the mysterious world she was conjuring. That night, Mrs. Margaret continued, a terrible storm swept through the town, and right in the middle of the park, a horrific accident occurred. A carousel collapsed during the storm, killing a young child. Since then, the park has become a gloomy, desolate place. The townspeople no longer dared to go there, not only because of the pain of loss, but also because of the strange tales that emerged after the accident. Jason shuddered, his curious gaze still locked on Mrs. Margaret. Her late-night stories always made him feel like he was drifting into another world, where the unexplainable became frighteningly real. After that night, people began to hear strange sounds coming from the park. The laughter of children, footsteps running across the grass, and even the cries of someone mourning. But when they went to check, the park was empty, with only the blades of grass swaying in the wind. Mrs. Margaret paused, her eyes following the flickering flames in the fireplace, as if recalling the distant memories she had lived through. "People say," she continued, her voice growing huskier, "that on bright, moonlit nights, if you stand near the angel statue in the park, you can hear the echoing laughter of the lost child. Some even claim to have seen its shadow running around the collapsed carousel, as if playing an endless game. But when you approach, that dark figure vanishes into thin air." Jason swallowed hard, feeling the atmosphere around him grow heavier. "And that's not all," Mrs. Margaret said, her voice suddenly dropping, sending chills down Jason's spine. "Once, on the anniversary of the accident, a group of young people, skeptical of the rumors, decided to enter the park to prove that it was just a myth." "What happened to them, Grandma?" Jason asked, his voice trembling with curiosity and fear. Mrs. Margaret looked directly into Jason's eyes, as if this story was truly important, and she wanted him to grasp what awaited him in the final words. "They never came back," she whispered, her tone strong enough to make Jason's heart race. "The next morning, their car was found parked outside the park gate, but there was no trace of them ever having left." The room fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Jason sat still, captivated by the story, unable to tear his gaze from Mrs. Margaret's aged face. Mrs. Margaret leaned back in her chair, letting out a soft sigh, as if she had poured out her heart after sharing that tale. Jason remained there, unsure of what to say, feeling trapped in the dark space Mrs. Margaret had just painted. "So that park, is it still there, Grandma?" Jason asked, his voice fading. Mrs. Margaret nodded, her eyes still staring out the window, as if the Willowwood Park existed in her mind. "The park is still there, it's just now forgotten, and no one dares to go near it anymore." The stories about it have been passed down through generations, and people still believe that park is haunted. No one knows exactly what happened to that group of young people, but since then, no one has dared to enter the park, especially at night. A chill ran down Jason's spine, but he couldn't suppress his curiosity. "Have you ever been there?" he asked. Mrs. Margaret fell silent for a long moment, then slowly replied, her voice now much more somber. "It's been a long time, when I was young, but not at night, and luckily I didn't hear anything at all. But from what I've heard, I know one thing. Willowwood is not a place for jesting. There are things there that we should not disturb." Jason sat in silence, his mind filled with images of an abandoned, gloomy park, with phantoms lurking in the darkness. "But you're still young, Jason. You should focus on joyful things instead of worrying about these ghost stories," Mrs. Margaret said, forcing a comforting smile, even though sadness lingered in her eyes. But Jason knew that this story would follow him throughout the night. Within him, a curiosity had ignited, and he couldn't stop himself from wondering, could what Mrs. Margaret spoke of be true? The fire continued to dance, but within Jason, he felt a cold breeze sweep through, as if from another world, the world of Willowwood Park. Jason couldn't contain his curiosity after hearing the chilling story that Grandma Margaret just told. He sat up straight and immediately asked her, "Grandma, how did that group of young friends get into the park? And what happened to them?" Grandma Margaret looked at him with a deep gaze, as if he had just unearthed a painful memory from long ago. She sighed softly, her hand resting on her lap, as if to calm the emotions rising within her. "Do you really want to know, Jason? This story isn't meant for weak-hearted children." Jason nodded vigorously. The curiosity inside him was overpowering everything else, and he wanted to know exactly what happened that night. Grandma Margaret fell silent for a moment, then began to continue. "That group of friends," she said, "consisted of 5 young people. Their names were Claire, Max, Tommy, Lucy, and Nate. They were all non-believers in ghostly legends and decided to prove that everything was just a rumor. They agreed to meet at 8 p.m., right at the entrance of Willowwood Park, to begin their exploration." Jason listened intently, imagining the scene of the young friends standing under the dim streetlights before the rusted iron gate of the park. "At first, they were very excited," Grandma Margaret continued. "With flashlights and cameras in hand, they showed no signs of fear. Claire, the bravest girl in the group, even joked that if they saw a ghost, she would film it to post online." Grandma Margaret paused, looking at Jason to make sure he was still following along. They stepped through the park's gate, feeling as if they were entering another world. The atmosphere inside was completely different from outside. It was still lightly raining, and cold winds rustled through the treetops. But as they ventured deeper into the park, everything seemed to change. Jason blinked, sensing the tension in Grandma Margaret's storytelling. The sound of the wind through the trees began to resemble whispers. The trees in the park seemed alive. The leaves fell silently, but instead of landing on the ground, they hovered in midair before abruptly disappearing into the darkness. Occasionally, Max and Lucy caught glimpses of shadows moving by, but when they turned around, nothing was there. Jason felt a shiver run down his spine as Grandma Margaret continued her tale. Suddenly, Claire stopped, her eyes wide with shock. In front of them were the animals in the park, small decorative statues of creatures. They seemed to be moving. A stone deer, which had been sitting still for ages, began to turn its head toward them. The other creatures slowly started to move as well, as if controlled by someone. But the strange thing was, no sound came from them. Jason jumped slightly, almost feeling the tension that the friends were experiencing. Lucy, Grandma Margaret continued, suddenly screamed, her terrified voice shattering the silence. She was staring intently at a bronze elephant in the far corner, which was slowly moving its feet. But when everyone looked back, the elephant was still, as if it had never moved. Grandma Margaret stopped, her eyes piercing into Jason's, making him even more anxious. "Do you know what the scariest thing is, Jason?" she whispered, almost in a hush. It wasn't the moving animals, nor the whispers of the wind, but the fact that from the moment they stepped into the park, they were no longer themselves. There was something in the air, like a curse, an invisible force weighing down upon them. Jason shuddered, his body feeling stiff. He sensed a quiet fear but couldn't tear himself away from the story. Then, Grandma Margaret said, things began to take a turn for the worse. Mysterious laughter echoed from every direction, like the sounds of children playing, but there was no one there. They saw swings swaying on their own, carousel horses suddenly moving, even though there was no wind. Nate tried to reassure everyone that it was just tricks of the imagination, but by then, fear had taken deep root in their hearts. Grandma Margaret lowered her head, as if she was reliving those feelings. And then, they saw the girl. Jason leaned forward, feeling the tension in the story rising to a climax. A little girl, dressed in a white dress, stood in the middle of the park, under the dim light. She didn't smile or cry, she just stood there, staring at the group of friends with deep, sorrowful eyes, as if pleading for something. Claire was the first to notice her, and she seemed entranced, unable to look away from the child's gaze. Jason swallowed hard, feeling the air in the room grow colder. The girl didn't say anything, but her eyes seemed to speak volumes. The whole group stood frozen, no one daring to move. They felt that something was wrong. The girl pointed toward the fallen carousel, the very carousel that had caused the accident years ago. Jason took a deep breath, the image of the girl in the park clear in his mind. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Just as the group followed the direction of the girl's pointing finger, a dark shadow slowly emerged. It was a man, tall, with glowing red eyes and a face twisted into a grotesque form. He advanced toward them slowly, each step making the air around them seem to still. Grandma Margaret paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. They knew it wasn't human. They realized they had entered a place they were never meant to be. Jason sat still, his heart racing, waiting for what would happen next. He knew this story held many mysteries, and Grandma Margaret had only begun to scratch the surface. The terrified scream tore through the night as the group of kids collided with one another, pushing and shoving in a panic. They had lost all sense of direction, frantically trying to run away from the shadowy figure of the man with glowing red eyes and the eerie little girl. Tiny feet trampled over the grass, dirt flying everywhere, but none of them cared. They were focused solely on escaping this deadly park. Lucy was the first to stumble, crashing into a large tree, but she didn't stay down for long. She quickly scrambled to her feet, trying to catch up with her friends. Breathing heavily, her heart raced in her chest, yet no one dared to look back at the horror that seemed to be chasing them. "Run faster!" Max shouted, but his voice was lost in the chilling wind that howled through the treetops. They kept running, their weary legs starting to feel like jelly, sweat pouring down their bodies. They dashed through the trails, past the dark areas of the park that the light could not reach. But when they finally stopped, they were met with something more terrifying than any ghost. Tommy, the youngest in the group, looked around with wide, fearful eyes. He grabbed Lucy's hand, his voice trembling. "Something's wrong. We came back to the same place. Lucy looked around, astonished and speechless. Everything looked horrifyingly familiar. The huge tree loomed right in front of them, along with the bench they had seen before. She shook her head in disbelief, but when she turned to Max and Nate, they were also scanning their surroundings with confusion. "What is going on?" "We ran away." Max stuttered, trying to take deep breaths to calm himself, but he couldn't hide the anxiety in his voice. Lucy shivered, gazing toward the large tree nearby where they had first seen it. "The tree? It's still here. And the bench too. Did we run in circles?" "No way." Tommy cried, his eyes wide as if he might cry. "We ran for so long, how could we come back here?" As the group panicked, Nate, the one who usually remained calm, tried to explain. "Maybe we lost our way and didn't realize we were running in circles," he said, though he felt a chill run down his spine at the unsettling coincidence. However, Tommy didn't buy it. He took a few steps back, staring intently at the large tree with its twisted branches. "No, this is wrong. I remember this tree. We're trapped." Max's eyes widened as he processed Tommy's words. He started to see it clearly. The tree didn't just look similar. It was the same tree they had passed earlier. A numbness spread throughout his body, as if an invisible hand was tightening around him from all sides. "We can't escape," Lucy whispered, her voice cracking in the dark space. She took a step back, her eyes darting around in panic. "Something is holding us back." The group fell silent, no one daring to say another word. They stood there, eyes wide, listening intently to every small sound around them. The park seemed eerily quiet, with only the soft breeze rustling through the leaves, yet the stillness offered them no comfort. Suddenly, Lucy plopped down on the grass, clutching her head, sobbing. "We can't get out. We can't escape." Tommy rushed to Lucy's side, trying to comfort her, but inside he felt no better. His heart raced, as if his chest might burst. Max and Nate stood next to each other, but no one could find the words to say. A sense of helplessness enveloped them all. Just then, from the cluster of trees in the distance, a mysterious laugh rang out. This time it wasn't a soft sound, but a piercing, mocking cackle. Max spun around, his eyes wide with horror. "Did you hear that? We're not alone." The group froze. The laughter grew clearer, echoing from all directions, as if dozens of people were surrounding them in the darkness. Lucy struggled to hold back her tears, her eyes wide with fear. Max shook as he stood up, scanning the area, but he couldn't see anything but shadowy forms. "Run! We have to get out of here!" Nate yelled, then bolted ahead, pulling Max and Tommy along with him. Lucy stumbled to her feet, chasing after them, her legs feeling as if they were glued to the ground. Every step heavy, as if something invisible was trying to hold her back. But no matter how many times they ran, no matter how hard they tried, everything remained the same. The trees, the bench, the dark foliage appeared before them, as if this park were a maze with no escape. Sweat poured down their faces, and the icy gusts of wind made them shiver. This time, Max was the first to stop. He gasped for breath, collapsing to the ground, his trembling hands touching the damp grass. "No way," he murmured, his eyes bloodshot from panic. "We can't get out." Tommy plopped down beside Max, tears streaming down his cheeks, his lips trembling. "Are we going to die here?" Lucy also sat down, cradling her head, trying desperately not to lose her mind from the fear. The group was trapped in the endless loop of this terrifying park, and now, all they could do was wait for the next horrifying event to unfold. Everything was becoming unbearable. Each child in the group was spiraling into a crisis. Lucy was sobbing, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she tried to wipe her tears with her sweat-soaked shirt. Max looked pale as if he were about to faint, his eyes staring blankly into the void. unable to speak. Tommy was shivering, muttering desperate prayers under his breath. The children had lost all composure, their minds racing with the worst images imaginable. No one dared to move. In the pitch-black space of the park, a terrifying silence enveloped everything, punctuated only by the wind whistling through their ears like someone whispering from a distant realm. But then, from above, a laugh rang out, tearing through the silence. This time it was no longer a distant sound. It echoed right beside them, close enough to send chills down their spines. The group turned around, and right before their eyes, the child with the blood-red eyes appeared once more. It was no longer standing on the ground but was perched precariously on an old swing, the swing having broken halfway. Its bony hand gripped the metal bar tightly, and its small feet swung back and forth in the air. The smile on its face was twisted and grotesque, its red eyes glowing in the darkness like two flames burning away every hope of the children. "Don't look at it," Max screamed in terror, but no one could tear their eyes away from that horrifying sight. A wave of panic washed over them, crawling through their very skin, freezing the group for a moment. Lucy could hardly breathe. Her heart raced so fast, she felt it might explode in her chest. Her trembling hands clutched Tommy tightly, but neither knew what to do. It felt as though the whole world around them was collapsing, and they could only wait for the next terrible thing to happen. But then, a strange strength surged within each of them. They couldn't stay here any longer. They had to escape. "Run, run!" Nate shouted, and no one needed to hear more. The group snapped out of their daze and turned to flee again, running as fast as they could. Their feet crunched on the dry leaves and weeds beneath them, the sounds piercing through the panic in every frantic step. They tried to hold on to each other, gripping hands to ensure no one was left behind. They ran like mad, but this time, the shadow of death seemed closer than ever. Suddenly, a scream pierced the darkness. The anguished cries sliced through their thoughts, making all the children stop in their tracks. Lucy turned around, her eyes wide in horror as she realized Nate, the strongest among them, had fallen. He tripped over a large rock, his head smashing into it. Blood streamed from Nate's forehead, splattering across his face, soaking the white shirt he wore. He lay motionless, unconscious on the damp grass. "Nate!" Max yelled, rushing to his friend. Lucy and Tommy followed close behind, but when they arrived they froze. A deadly silence enveloped them. Max placed his hand on Nate's chest, his eyes red with worry. He wasn't breathing. His heart wasn't beating. "No, it can't be," Lucy stammered, tears streaming down her cheeks. She stepped back a few paces, unable to believe what was happening right before her eyes. Tommy knelt beside Nate, placing his small back, trembling hands on his friend as if a gentle shake would wake Nate up, that he would smile at them again. But he would never rise again. Nate was gone. "What do we do now?" Lucy asked, her voice so small it was barely audible. The group was trapped in a nightmare they could never have imagined. But then, from afar, the eerie laughter echoed once more. The ghostly child, with its burning red eyes, was approaching them. Its figure was hazy in the night, but each of its footsteps seemed to tear through the air like a storm rolling in. Tommy trembled, his eyes wide with fear. We have to run. If we don't, it will kill us all," he shouted, tears streaming down his pale face. Despair surged in their hearts, but no one dared to oppose him. Max looked down at Nate one last time, his lips pressed together in helplessness. Then, with a heavy sigh, he stood up, pulling Lucy and Tommy to their feet. They had to leave immediately. There was no time left to cry. In their panic, the group decided to leave Nate behind. They had no other choice. The ghostly child had come too close, and if they stayed just 1 second longer, they would share Nate's fate. The group ran while sobbing. Tears of fear and loss streamed down their faces. Their sobs echoed in the dark, mingling with the mad laughter of the ghostly child behind them. Tonight, they had lost one of their own, and now they could only hope they wouldn't lose anyone else. Darkness still surrounded them, and ahead lay a long journey fraught with peril. But in each child's heart, the fear had sunk deep into their minds, with no one knowing that the worst was yet to come. The 4 kids ran, crying and gasping for breath, tears mingling with sweat, soaking their panicked faces. Max led the way, his feet racing across the thick patches of grass, but in the frenzy, he tripped over something. His foot slid, and before he could realize it, he tumbled down. A scream shattered the stillness of the air. Max vanished in an instant, plummeting straight down into a deep, dark pit with no bottom in sight. The hole had appeared suddenly, lurking among the old trees and tall grass. Lucy, Tommy, and Claire immediately halted, their mouths agape in horror, surrounding the pit, their eyes peering into nothing but endless darkness. "Max! Max!" Tommy shouted, his voice trembling with desperation. No answer came. The darkness below swallowed every sound, leaving only the patter of rain mingling with the eerie whistling of the wind through the ancient trees, cold and foreboding. Claire choked back a sob, her eyes red from fear, while Lucy couldn't stop shivering. "What do we do now, Max? Max is..." Her voice trailed off in panic. The 3 stood gazing into the abyss, dark as an undefined chasm, unsure of what to do. Max was gone. Another one lost. The pit seemed as though it had been there forever, waiting for someone to unwittingly fall in. It felt as if everything in this park was arranged to lead each child into death. Tommy took a step back, his legs trembling as if about to give way. "It can't be. It can't be. How could this happen?" he muttered, staring into the black hole before him. But there was no more time for panic. A light drizzle began to fall, raindrops collecting in their hair and on their skin, chilling the air even further. The rain seemed to drown any remaining hope in a wet blanket of despair. The sky was overcast, wind howled through the leaves, and the chilling laughter echoed from behind, growing closer by the second. That sound, the laughter of a child with glowing red eyes, would not let them go. It came nearer with every passing second, and the fear within the 3 children surged. Claire held tightly to Lucy's hand, while Tommy stood frozen in place, his eyes red and wide, trembling in the cold drizzle. "Run! We have to run, or it will kill us all," Tommy shouted. Lucy hesitated for a moment, but Chloe pulled her hand, and then all 3 turned and fled once again. Their footsteps rushed across the wet grass, the sound of rain drumming around them. Each child's heart raced wildly, panic turning everything into chaos in their minds. Each step felt like it was pulling them down with fear and exhaustion. But there was no other choice. The creepy laughter followed them every step of the way, and the nightmares seemed endless. Claire turned back for a glance, and in that moment, she saw the silhouette of the creepy child. It was still coming closer, its eyes glowing like hellfire, and its twisted smile a mockery. Claire's heart felt like it was being squeezed. She turned to face Lucy and Tommy, her eyes wide, gasping, "We're never getting out of this. It's going to get us all." Lucy, who had always tried to stay calm, was now nearly resigned. Cold raindrops fell on her face, mingling with her tears. She didn't know how much longer she could run, and it seemed everything Hub 5.2 around them was collapsing. Each of their steps became heavier, each passing moment draining their strength. "Don't say that, Claire. We'll survive. We'll get out of here." Tommy tried to shout, though he didn't truly believe it. But all 3 understood that if they stopped now, it would all be over. The sky above was so dark that no moon or stars were visible. Each cold gust of wind swept by, carrying whispers that felt like haunting murmurs. The group had no idea how far they had run, nor could they recognize which way led out of this park anymore. It felt as though they were trapped in a maze of their own fear, and no matter how far they ran, the end always led them back to where they began. With each heavy step, Lucy slipped and fell onto the damp ground, but Tommy and Chloe quickly helped her up, refusing to leave her behind. "We can't stop. We can't stop," Tommy gasped, feeling like his lungs were about to burst from exhaustion. But then, from somewhere far off, a glimmer of light caught their eyes. It was light. All three paused, staring ahead, their eyes sparkling with a flicker of fragile hope. Claire pointed toward it, her voice trembling. "It could be the way out. We might have a chance." Lucy nodded, and the three resumed running. The light grew clearer, illuminating the path ahead, but at the same time, the chilling laughter behind them also grew louder. The creepy child was closing in, its heavy footsteps echoing right behind the kids, as if it was about to touch them. Lucy's heart raced furiously, her hand gripping Tommy's and Chloe's tightly, trying to urge them to run faster. The light before them seemed like their last opportunity, and despite being so exhausted that they felt numb, they pressed on. But just as they neared the place, the light extinguished. The three children seemed to have seen a glimmer of life, a fragile escape amidst the despairing darkness. But in an instant, that light abruptly extinguished, as if it had never existed. Lucy, Tommy, and Claire felt their hearts sink simultaneously. The hope that had just begun to blossom vanished in a heartbeat. Darkness enveloped them again, profound and impenetrable. They halted, panting, unsure of what to do next. The rain began to fall more heavily, each cold droplet seeping into their skin, melding with their labored breaths. Sinister laughter from behind seemed to draw closer, signaling that death was imminent. "What do we do now?" Chloe sobbed, her eyes wide with panic. "There's no way out. There's nothing left." Tommy shook his head, unwilling to accept this grim reality. "No, it can't be. There has to be a way. We have to find a way out of here." He looked around, but all he saw was darkness, the wet trunks of trees, and the increasingly heavy rain. Lucy trembled, her legs exhausted and devoid of strength. She wanted to sit down, to give up, but the horror of the laughter urged her to keep going. "We can't stop here." Suddenly, a thud echoed from beneath their feet. They stumbled, and before they could comprehend what was happening, the ground gave way beneath them. Lucy, Tommy, and Claire slid down, falling straight into something damp and cold. The space around them abruptly turned into an inky darkness, chilling to the bone. "Ugh! Help! Help me!" Tommy screamed, the suffocating feeling overwhelming him as icy water rushed into his mouth. The three children plunged into a large pond, the water thick and frigid, connected to the vast marsh beyond. The water was so deep that their feet couldn't reach the bottom, and in an instant they were submerged in the pitch-black waters. "Tommy!" Lucy yelled, struggling to keep her head above the surface, but panic rendered her immobile. Her cries echoed in vain, blending with the sound of the rain pouring onto the pond's surface. Claire fought to swim upward, but her limbs were fatigued, her strength fading. She flailed desperately, searching for something to cling to, but only found the frigid water and the endless darkness surrounding her. Each wave of dark water crashed against the children's faces, gentle yet deadly ripples undulating on the pond's surface. The sky was a dark void, void of stars without a single ray of light. This time, there was no hope left. The three children understood they had no escape. Tommy floundered in the water, but eventually he too began to sink, his hands reaching for something, anything, but grasping nothing. His gasping breaths grew weaker. Claire, in panic, thrashed about hopelessly. Every attempt to rise to the surface only pulled her deeper into the water. Despite her exhaustion, Lucy tried to swim closer to Tommy and Claire, but all her efforts were futile. The icy water wrapped around her like a vice, dragging her slowly down to the bottom of the pond. Her skin numbed, each breath becoming increasingly difficult. The three children struggled hopelessly, panic seeping into their thoughts, into every heartbeat. But then, the coldness of the water began to paralyze their bodies. Their screams were gradually drowned out by the sound of the water before fading into silence. In that moment, it seemed as if time stood still. The surface of the water grew calm, with only gentle ripples spreading quietly across the pond. No sounds echoed, no breaths, screams, or horrific laughter remained. The children vanished, sinking into the depths of the murky pond, leaving no trace behind. Their final struggles became meaningless, swallowed by the cold, dark water. The eerie pond had transformed into a chilling grave, pulling them down to a place from which there would be no return. The drizzle continued to pour heavily, mingling with the eerie stillness in the air. The surface remained quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. No one witnessed the tragic end of those three children. Far off, by the pond's edge, a small shadow appeared. A child with glowing red eyes stood there, staring intently at the spot where Lucy, Tommy, and Claire had just submerged. Its gaze sparkled ominously in the dark night, seemingly satisfied with the children's fate. A grotesque smile spread across its ghostly face, followed by a chilling laugh that echoed through the gloomy space. The ghostly child no longer needed to chase after them. The children had walked into the final trap on their own, and now they would forever lie beneath the cold, deep waters of this pond, never to return. The laughter of the ghostly child gradually faded into the drizzle. Everything became silent, leaving only the darkness and the chill of the night. Reality suddenly surged back in the cloudy eyes of Mrs. Margaret, pulling her from a terrifying memory. Little Jason was still sitting there, his round eyes gazing at her curiously. He tilted his head and asked, "So, after that, did anyone else ever come to that park again?" Mrs. Margaret sighed softly, her bony hands resting on her knees, her gaze drifting out the window as if searching the dark past. The dim light from the overhead lamp cast shadows on her aged face, accentuating the deep wrinkles on her forehead. She took a sip of tea, then gently spoke, her voice gravelly with a hint of coldness. "From that point on," she began, her eyes glued to the night outside, "no one dared to set foot in that park, especially not at midnight. That place has been forgotten, abandoned. But what no one knows is that those who are there, those little souls, they are still around." Jason listened intently, his eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and fear. He hesitantly asked, "The little souls? What do you mean?" Mrs. Margaret lowered her head slightly, her trembling hand touching the teacup as if to steady herself. She knew this story would terrify Jason, but the truth is always worse than what people imagine. She couldn't hide it forever. After the children disappeared, she continued, her voice growing deeper, there wasn't just one ghost child in the park anymore. No, now there were 5 more. Those 5 children, they are still there, every night, sitting on the old abandoned swing set, laughing eerily, and waiting. Jason didn't understand. He furrowed his brow and asked, "Waiting for what, Grandma? Who are they waiting for?" Mrs. Margaret looked straight into Jason's eyes, her gaze reflecting worry, yet chillingly cold. "They are waiting for other children, Jason. Anyone who dares to enter that park when night falls, they will be taken. They will not let anyone go." Jason shivered. He felt a chill running down his back, but couldn't take his eyes off her. He tried to remain calm, but his curiosity overpowered his fear. But why do they take the other children? Mrs. Margaret smiled faintly, but her smile was not warm. It was mysterious and frightening. They want to play, Jason. They want more friends to join in their games, their horrifying and bizarre games. Every child who steps into that park will be drawn into a whirlwind of terror. They will not be able to escape. Jason was stunned. He could feel the cold atmosphere around him, as if Mrs. Margaret's words had brought the darkness of that park into this room. He swallowed hard, his gaze drifting out the window. "Can we see them, Grandma?" Mrs. Margaret shook her head. "Not everyone can see them. Only those who dare to enter the park at night can see them. But one thing is certain, Jason, those souls never disappear. They will forever be there, laughing, chasing, and luring other children to join in their games." She paused for a moment, her gaze suddenly distant. "Sometimes on those chilly, drizzly nights, if you stand from afar, you can hear their laughter echoing back very softly, very faintly. It is the laughter of the trapped souls, children who will never grow up, forever stuck between the worlds of the living and the dead." Jason sat in silence, Mrs. Margaret's words embedding deeply in his mind. He couldn't dare imagine himself in that situation, trapped with those ghostly souls, drawn into an endless cycle of horrific games, but he still couldn't stop being curious. "Grandma, is there any way to help those children, to set them free?" Mrs. Margaret looked at him thoughtfully, then shook her head. "No one knows for sure, Jason. But there's a rumor that only when that park is completely destroyed can the souls escape. But think about it. Who would dare go there and do that?" She looked out the window again, her voice becoming vague. "That park is now just an abandoned, forgotten place. But those who lost their lives there will never forget. They will wait forever, and anyone who dares to step in will never return." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't dare ask anything more, sitting silently, staring at Mrs. Margaret, his heart filled with confusion. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the night continued to cast a dark, mysterious, and horrifying veil over the world.